good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar from WSO2. So this webinar focuses on enterprise API marketplaces, and this will be done by yours truly, Mifan Karim. So before getting started, some house rules. I will be going through the webinar. So I'll be showing you a bunch of slides, and we'll be talking about some use cases, some practical examples, some of the theory, etc. There is, on the GoToWebinar screen itself, you have a tab to ask questions. So if you have any questions, just type that into the tab itself, and either during the session or at the end of the session, I'll basically go through the questions and we can get them answered. So we'd like to make this interactive, so of course, go ahead and ask the questions. At the end of the webinar, following the webinar, we will basically put up the recording of the webinar, and we'll also send across the slides to you. So without further delay, let me get started. My webinar today will focus on enterprise API marketplaces, and I've extended the topic a bit as well to talk about business platforms and the importance of both marketplaces and business platforms for digital transformation. My name is Mifan Karim, as I mentioned. I am the Senior Director of Solutions Architecture at WSO2. I'm based out of the New York office. So I'm part of the Solutions Architecture team, which works closely with our customers. So we work with our customers both from a pre-engagement perspective, so pre-sales, as well as a post-sales perspective on the architectural aspects. Okay, so that said, this is basically one of the webinars that we have. We do have lots of other webinars, workshops. We have a New York Summit coming up as well. So if you need further information, go onto the WSO2 website at wso2.com, and there's a page called Events where you can see all the webinars and workshops and register for them. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'll be covering today is the overall digital business landscape and how the platform business model works, how it moved from a linear business model to a platform business model, and what that means for the modern internet business and what it means for digital transformation as a whole. We'll look at the relationship between these platform business models and the marketplace business model, and how and why a platform or marketplace needs to be used. We will then go into one of the case studies of a large telco, basically, who has successfully developed and designed API marketplace. So we'll look at the advantages that they had. We will then go into the business advantages and the next steps of building an API marketplace, technology aspects. We will basically summarize off with some of the business advantages and an architecture discussion as well. I also have a diagram on how to build an internal enterprise API marketplace with a federated API management model as well. So let's get started. So if you've seen various WSO2 presentations, you might have seen this slide on the digital business landscape. So the digital business landscape slide covers some of the aspects that are important in competing in the modern digital world. So if you need to release digital products or digital services or transform your organization and basically achieve digital transformation, there are certain key characteristics that you need to focus on. One is the evolving business models. So you need to basically start thinking about newer digital products, how by extending or exposing certain parts of your organization, like certain services, certain internal applications to the external world or to your internal stakeholders, how that basically leads to a participatory business model or a platform business model. So we'll be focusing more on that area today. But at the same time, how do you focus on customer experience? And customers here is not a pure consumer of technology, but also producers of technology, or your partners, your stakeholders, your supply chain. So how do you basically optimize customer experience across multiple channels? And then, of course, doing all of this while you optimize operations. So we are hearing lots of terminology like lean development, agile practices, microservices, so on and so forth, cloud-based native infrastructure, so on and so forth, right? So all of this basically leads to lean or optimized operations. So the idea is that if you come up with a business idea or business plan or a digital product design, you need to be able to launch that digital product in an iterative manner, using an iterative architecture, using agile principles quickly. Right? So we are looking at nightly builds. We are looking at basically cloud-based continuous deployment models. So the idea is that you don't spend like 6 months in R&D and another 1 year to basically launch the first version of the product, but you basically continuously launch. And to do that, you need to basically optimize your internal operations, right? Automate them, containerize them, basically have the continuous integration, continuous deployment models, so on and so forth. Right. But at the same time, this is a good quote from Fred Wilson, who's the founder of USV. This is quoted in the Modern Monopolies book. So software alone is a commodity. There's nothing stopping anyone from copying the feature set, making it better, cheaper, or faster. Right? So we understand that. So software is a commodity. So it's not good enough anymore to basically just build the software. Like spend 6 months R&D, build the software, release it, and then wait for consumers to come. Along with continuous innovation, very stringent quality standards, and continuous optimization of the deployment, along with all of that, we also need to involve the customer or involve the stakeholders into our business. So that's where basically a platform business model comes in. So hopefully you can see this definition on this funky orange color that I have. But I'll read it out as well. So a platform in its simplest sense is a business model that facilitates exchange between stakeholders of a business. So the key point here is that we are not talking about a technology platform. Yes, you heard the fact that yes, WSO2 is a technology platform. You basically have the various components. You can use the technology where and when you need it. But this terminology here is a business terminology. So what we're trying to do here is to come up with a business platform, a business model that connects the stakeholders of the business and ensures that the stakeholders can get involved in the success of the business. So the stakeholders here can be anyone. It can be the producers of services and goods. It can be the consumers of these goods and services. It can be your partners that basically sell to their customers. It can be the supply chain that is linked, that provides various input into your system. And it can even be your competitors as well. So remember there was this word called co-opetition that you learned in business school. So you bring in the competitors as well to basically get involved in your platform business model. So the important thing is to have a technology platform that can enable this business platform. Right? So what does that mean? So in the past, we've heard of this normal business model. The traditional business model that we are aware of is called the pipe business model or linear business model, depending on the terminology. So example again, someone selling goods in a normal shop, manufacturing of certain things, right? So people buy them. So the value here is produced upstream. Right? So someone basically builds or manufactures a good, and then that good is sold in basically some retail outlet or on a website. Right? And someone basically comes and consumes that downstream. Right? So the value is basically produced upstream, and the value is consumed downstream. User acquisition is straightforward here. Right? So you basically go out and look for users. So the more consumers you have, the more successful your business might become. Product design is focused on consumers, so that's your key metric there. If you're going to build a product, you need to ensure that the most number of consumers will basically consume that product. Right? So you target it to that demography, and all of that. You do your market studies for that. Monetization, again, is quite straightforward. Of course, it can be complex, but it's focused on consumers, right? So you have X amount, you maybe have discounts, but you have Y amount of consumers, so you get some kind of a monetization model, right? So a good example is like the normal goods and services or manufacturing. Whereas if you switch to the other side, you have the platform business models. So here, users create and consume value. So what does that mean? So here, the user is the producer of the goods and service, and at the same time, there's a different set of users who is also the consumers of that goods and service. And so users create and consume the value here. So if you take APIs, right, there are API producers and there are API consumers. API producers might be internal employees of your organization. It might be employees of cross-business units who you don't have control over. It might be external stakeholders, totally external to your organization. So anyone can come and build your APIs, expose APIs. And those APIs will basically be consumed by various consumers. Right? So the success of that model is twofold. You have the consumers and you have the producers. So everything should work. The platform can be extended via APIs. So you can basically extend upon the platform itself by exposing APIs here. In terms of value, the first few users or user acquisition, the first few users might have minimal value. So let's say you have a platform. Let's say it's Uber. Uber is a good example of a platform model. So Uber has the platform, and let's say you have riders who sign up with Uber. So if you don't have enough drivers, there is no real value for the initial set of riders. Right? So it's a chicken and egg problem that needs to be solved. You need to have the right producers and the right consumers, and you need to have that balance at any given time. So when it comes to product design, the platform business model focuses on stakeholders. So it can be the producers, it can be the consumers, it can be your B2B partners. So the focus is on the stakeholders as opposed to purely on consumers. When it comes to monetization, as opposed to just purely focusing on consumers, there needs to be unique business models here. Right? You need to have enough incentives to basically promote the producers to produce services and goods, and you need to have enough incentives for consumers to basically consume. So it's a fine line. You cannot have a very high revenue share as well, but then you might have some models like the revenue share model, a freemium model, basically a percentage model, so on and so forth. So the internet has expatiated basically the platform business model, right? And there's loads of new platform models coming up due to the fact that they are based on the internet. So if you take a few examples, let's say Britannica Encyclopedia versus Wikipedia. Britannica Encyclopedia was basically one of the larger encyclopedias back in the day, and it was a push model, a pipe business model, where consumers come and basically consume the content in the encyclopedia. But Wikipedia turned that on its head. So the users themselves participate in basically publishing the content, and then you have another set of users who come and consume that content as well. And revenue can be driven by advertisements and various donations and various other formats. Similarly, TV channels versus YouTube. Right? That's an apparent one, where TV channels just continuously broadcast, whereas YouTube has a participatory business model. So what's a marketplace then? The marketplace, the traditional definition of a marketplace is that it is a specialized platform focusing on connecting the producers to the consumers. So basically the marketplace is really the technology, the activities, the evangelism, so on and so forth, to promote producers to produce more and to promote consumers to consume more. So it's a specialized type of platform. In some articles, in some content pages out there, you see that the terminology of platform and marketplace is used interchangeably, but there is a specific distinction between them as well. But at the end of the day, an API platform and an API marketplace basically can be quite similar. So let's look at an API marketplace now. So the definition of an API marketplace here is a platform which effectively connects API producers and API consumers. And it does this via the tools, the technologies, the activities that are required to basically enable. Right. So the bottom line, you need to ensure producers produce more and ensure consumers consume more in an effective way. Right. So let's take a use case here. So one of the customers that I've worked with in the past is the AGILE group. This is basically one of the largest telcos in the Asia Pacific. And the AGILE group is based out of Malaysia, and it has 7 subsidiaries in different countries. Dialog Axiata is the largest telco provider in Sri Lanka. And so that the logo you see here is Dialog, but so this is applicable for the whole group as well. So one of the problems Dialog had internally was that they had a large IT team, and basically for the different goods and services, you had different unique software development teams who built their own underlying services, which connected to their own business systems and basically exposed their own set of services and consumed those services. Right? So you had a duplication of effort. You had a large number of services being rebuilt, and there was no way to interact between those various divisions. And more importantly, there was no way to effectively see what's going on between those divisions or basically monetize or monitor the various activities. So one of the initiatives Dialog took was to deploy an API management solution and an integration solution internally. And then that led to basically APIs being exposed from each of these divisions. So then the next step is to ensure that becomes an API marketplace. So what that means is you just don't deploy the API management solution and then wait till it works or wait till it fails, for instance. But you actually follow up and you have activities like hackathons, evangelism events, workshops, seminars, conferences, etc. So in essence, you need to ensure that the producers of the various divisions produce the right set of APIs, that they have the necessary documentation, the metadata surrounding those APIs, that these APIs are discoverable by the other business units or application developers from within the organization, so on and so forth. So in a nutshell, you need to ensure that there are enough and more APIs that are produced. You need to ensure that you don't duplicate effort or you don't recreate a service that is already created. And you also need to ensure that there are enough consumption. There's enough consumption of these APIs, and there are users who build applications using those various APIs. So then that goes a step further, right? You need to have some sort of an incentive, not just a job-related incentive, but some other kind of incentive to ensure that people innovate internally as well. Because an API marketplace is a very good place for the developers to innovate, for developers to be more creative, and to focus on internal innovation of the organization. So that might mean leaderboards, that might mean some kind of a bonus scheme at the end of the year, looking at who has produced or who has consumed the most APIs, or which APIs are consumed the most, so on and so forth. So that would, of course, mean that you have the right reporting capabilities, analytics, notifications and alerts, the dashboards, so on and so forth. Right. So Dialog launched this internally. They had very good success on that, and you can see at the bottom of the page there's a URL to the Dialog API developer portal, which is an external portal. There's a number of conference talks on this as well on this successful API marketplace implementation. So once that was done, Dialog then basically exposed this to the external world as well. So roughly, if you had around 400 to 500 internal APIs, the external API marketplace had around 50 to 60 external APIs. And these are APIs like an API to send SMS, an API to do location-based services, to do direct operator billing, so on and so forth. So the same concepts then apply to the external API marketplace. But now you need to focus on a different audience set. So now you need to basically ensure that the enterprises or the long tail developers on the internet come and basically create applications, innovative applications using the various APIs. So at that point, one of the other challenges is that you need to come up with a business model. So a business model can be a revenue share model where you say, okay, 60% goes to the network operator and 40% revenue goes to the application provider, or freemium model, or some kind of a percentage model, so on and so forth. But the same concepts apply there as well. You need to do hackathons, you need to do workshops, seminars, conferences, you need to have enough documentation, etc., to ensure these applications are created. And Dialog had a separate team going out and doing these hackathons, and that was very successful. So Dialog basically sent teams to the enterprises, to schools, to universities to try to promote this program. So Dialog also had a venture capital program for innovative applications built using those various APIs. And there's a lot of successful stories around that, around the applications that were built there. So I advise that you can go and have a look at the various talks that are available out there. So, okay, so let's take that as an example and look at the business advantages of an API marketplace. So let me just quickly check the thing. Okay. So, of course, so let's really summarize what we looked at. So, discovery of APIs by the consumers. So, the consumers can be internal application developers, or they can be external application developers. So, they need to be able to discover the APIs quite easily. So, these can be actual users, or in today's era, it can be actual systems as well. So, when you look at the microservices model, you need well-defined APIs which can be discovered by the various systems. Okay? Free use of APIs. So we want to ensure that APIs are published, but we also want to ensure that that the existing services are not published as API, or you don't republish an API 5 different times. Right? So before publishing an API, you should be able to discover whether that API is already available and then publish. So that means you need to have the standards in place. You need to have the governance model in place. So all of these additional aspects need to be thought about as well. Social features encourage participation. So once you publish your API, or once you start building an application, you should be able to communicate with the developer. For instance, it's as we mentioned, this is not a push model. This is not a linear model that we're focusing on. So if I publish an API, one of the consumers should be able to come and tell me, hey, I need this and this parameters for this API, or there needs to be a self-development way for me to go and create those changes myself. So that can be like a social network embedded there. That can be like tagging or forums, etc. Or it can be an embedded Jira or issue tracking system, so on and so forth. Evangelism to encourage application development usage. Similarly, to encourage API design and development. Right? So once you start publishing APIs and once applications start coming up, you also need to evangelize this. So that means having hackathons within enterprises, having various programs, basically so on and so forth. So in WSO2 as well, we have a WSO2 API hackathon program, which can be deployed, and we basically do trainings, sample coding examples, hands-on, so on and so forth as part of that, to encourage users to both publish APIs and at the same time create applications around these APIs. API composition is a useful feature, a unique feature that we are looking at as well. So if, as I mentioned, if a consumer needs certain features in an API, either he can basically come back and tell the producer that I need these features, or you can build the features yourself or modify the API. So the ability to modify the APIs that are published, or the ability to mash up a number of APIs and create a new API around it, is the capability of API composition. So today, you have this capability usually at the back end using integration, and the people or the producers of the API or owners of the API have access to do this. But we are now talking about consumers of the API trying to do this. So that's basically a feature that is available in the next version of the WSO2 API Manager. Promote participation via incentives. So in one of the white papers that I wrote, I speak about gamification or incentives. So simple things like having a leaderboard, having the top API creator of the month, basically like pointing out to the user that who created the API that was consumed the most within this specific period, or by the person who creates an application that consumes the most API. Right? So these leaderboards or having these simple incentives go a long way in promoting a marketplace, a successful, workable, a sustainable market. So incentives can be bonuses, it can be financial incentives, it can be social incentives, so on and so forth. Governance and standards are, of course, very important. So especially when you have multiple divisions now trying to publish APIs in a specific, very large organization, or you have external stakeholders trying to publish APIs. You need to ensure that these APIs follow a certain standard, that they are governed, that they have very strict life cycles associated with them, they have promotion and demotion criteria, workflows, and verification steps, so on and so forth. So that needs to be built into the platform itself. Cross-division usage is another business advantage. So the focus here is you have a single marketplace, but you be able to access APIs from various divisions or various business units. So you promote cross-division usage. So you then go on to promote cross-division business models and track usage, so on and so forth. And then finally, monetization is a key area as well. You should be able to monetize APIs that are externally exposed, as well as monetize APIs to some extent between the various business units. So monetization models can be a freemium model, a revenue share model, so on and so forth. So there's a large number of API monetization models out there, and the platform needs to be able to support these models. So that's the business advantages. So let's look at building an enterprise API marketplace with WSO2. So there's a bunch of steps. I've just listed various steps, not necessarily in this given order. So there's no specific order for this. But I'll just talk about some of these areas, and then I can also talk about some of the examples of these areas. So I have a few slides following this to talk about some of the examples. So the first step is to define an API strategy, of course. So that's even before you think about an API marketplace, you need to think about your API strategy and your technology strategy. So your API strategy here goes into detail about what you're going to do with your APIs, what you're going to expose within the organization, what kind of services you're going to expose. Are these services going to be exposed only internally, or APIs exposed internally, or is it going to be externally, or is it going to be basically both? So internal API marketplace versus external API marketplace versus a hybrid model there. So internal API marketplaces are also quite important, especially in very large organizations, and especially if you want to ensure that the organization can internally innovate and internally be creative as well. Right? So whilst having the governance and standards in place, you also need to provide that flexibility or that distributed model so that internal developers can publish APIs, right? or internally innovate. Right? So that's part of your API strategy or your business strategy, and that really also defines how you would monetize those APIs, what kind of digital products you would expose, what kind of publicity you are looking at from these APIs being exposed externally, so on and so forth. So this would basically be one of the main steps and the most critical steps in your organization, to have some kind of an API strategy, maybe a 1 year, 2 year, or 5 year API strategy, forecasting what your future vision would be as well. So you need to have your vision, mission statements all laid out there. So once you have that business strategy, the next steps would be to define your technology strategy. So as part of the technology strategy, yes, you need an API management platform to power the API marketplace. But at the same time, you would have an identity scenario, right? You'd have a security scenario. You would basically need to authenticate your various enterprises using those enterprise authentication systems, which means you need to federate. You would have multiple applications maybe, so you need to do single sign-on. You might have an integration requirement where you need to transform the services or APIs before exposing them externally. So on and so forth, right? So you have multiple requirements. So you need a technology platform which supports API management as the core, but then which can also provide identity integration, analytics, so on and so forth as additional capabilities as well. So the second part there is to decide whether this is going to be a software as a service API model, whether you're going to use some kind of a vendor software as a service model similar to the WSO2 API cloud, or whether you're going to deploy this on-premise on your data center, or whether you're going to deploy it on your private cloud, or whether you're going to have a hybrid of both models. Right? So again, you need to select a vendor that has the cloud, that has software as a service, that has on-premise, that has all these technologies out there. Another important consideration is, of course, open source. Right? So whether you need the technology to be open source, whether you should be able to go in and make changes, or whether you need to be able to see what's exactly going on in the back end. So this is quite important. Let's say if you're a finance organization, for instance, and you want to see exactly how this is talking to your back-end endpoint. So the technology strategy is quite important there. You might have to basically look at multiple vendors. You might have to do quick POCs to see how easy it is to use, how easy it is to integrate to your existing CI/CD processes, how easy it is to set up, to scale, to perform, so on and so forth. Right? So that's all part of your technology strategy. So the two areas that I spoke about, the business and the technology strategy, so a few slides on that. So one is the platform, technology platform side. And we spoke about the importance of having a platform that supports much more than API management. Right? So WSO2's set of products support API management, and along with that, an integration platform that can work very closely with API management, that can provide API mediation as well. An identity and access management platform that can provide federation, single sign-on, so on and so forth. An analytics platform that provides real-time notifications, alerts, API analytics, so on and so forth, and which can also be the basis of your monetization and monitoring of cross divisions, etc. And an IoT platform that basically enables you to manage devices, manage basically sensors, provision them, have analytics around them, security around them, so on and so forth. Right? And the advantage, of course, is this is available. This is all open source, and this is available in multiple flavors. You have the, if you take the API manager specifically, you have the API cloud, which is a hosted offering, a pay-as-you-go offering, which is a software as a service multi-tenanted model. So that's the easiest way to get started. You just create a tenant and start using it. You then have a managed cloud, which is a private cloud option, which is managed by the WSO2 team, but your specific private deployment on a data center of your choice. And then, of course, you have the private on-premise deployment, where you download the product and you deploy it and you run it, and WSO2 can support that deployment for you. So those are all part of the technology platform. So then the next step is to engage and empower producers and at the same time facilitate consumers. So this is one of the most key aspects of a marketplace. So you do have API management deployments out there, but the marketplace, as I mentioned, goes one step further and tries to ensure that the API management platform works in a sustainable manner and basically contributes back to business, right? And it basically promotes that platform business model. So you don't just deploy the technology out there, but that you go heads out to try to ensure that the platform business model is successful. So as part of this, you need to evangelize and empower consumers. So consumers here would access, so there are two types of consumers. There are the consumers of the listed APIs or the application developers here who would come looking for various APIs and who would build applications and services and even APIs around these existing APIs. Right? So those are consumers of the system. And then you have consumers of the application itself, which is outside this API marketplace. So that's really an application marketplace concept, or an ecosystem marketplace. So the two types of consumers. So if we focus on the API consumers here, one of the important concepts is a developer portal, an API developer portal. So this is a screenshot of the WSO2 API Clouds developer portal here, which shows you a bunch of APIs which can be grouped by name, by tag, which have social features, and basically so on and so forth. So this allows application developers to come, discover these APIs, test these APIs in an online console itself, or by using some testing tool externally. And then once you're satisfied with that API, you can basically subscribe to this API. And all of the subscription flows, the registration flows can all be associated with the workflow. So once you have all of that in place, you then need to ensure that more and more application developers come to look for APIs. So these APIs should be discoverable. They need to have the right namespaces, the context, the documentation, the SDKs, the how-tos, the forums, etc. Everything associated so that you make the application development as seamless as possible. You can, of course, go one step further, and which is where I mentioned ecosystem marketplaces, where you can have application templates or SDKs that basically specifically wrap certain types of API. So for instance, if this is a telco, and if you go back to the dialog telco example I spoke about, you can have SMS APIs, LB, location-based services APIs, and let's say direct operator billing APIs. So if you want to build an SMS mobile application, you can basically have an SDK which already wraps these APIs. Right? So you just download the SDK and build an application using Android. Right? So you have an Android SDK for that. Or you can basically go one step further and have a platform-specific template generator, which generates a template for you, and you just go and download and start building on top of that. So in the API developer portal as well of WSO2, you have the ability to access various kinds of SDKs, like Android, iOS SDKs, etc. So once you have the developer portal and you have application consumers consuming those APIs, testing those APIs and subscribing to them, one part of the story is done. Right? So so you need to have incentives, you need to have evangelism activities to ensure they can build it in the right way. They have the appropriate documentation, etc., to build applications. So the API marketplace here is this developer portal, as you can see in this diagram. But also you're connecting the API producers at the bottom of the diagram to the consumers, and you have technology on the right-hand side, which is shown there. So you have the API gateway, that's the runtime, API security, the governance models, the analytics models, etc. And on the left, you can see the various activities like workshops, hackathons, incentives, evangelism, etc. Right? Monetization, so on and so forth. So everything's needed for a successful marketplace there. So if you go back to that list that I had, facilitating consumers mean that you need to have like a UI for API producers to publish APIs. But at the same time, you need to be able to tie into an organizational process. So if an organization uses Jenkins and Maven or Bamboo or whatever to basically build applications for source control, for building, for continuous deployment, etc., you cannot go and push a different model just for API creation. Right? So this model should fit in to your existing CI/CD process. So the WSO2 API Manager allows you to plug in to your existing CI/CD process using system API. But whatever technology you use, you should have the flexibility of doing the design and publishing via a wizard or UI, or by plugging into command line tools and your CI/CD process. So after evangelizing that as well, so incentives are also important. So when it comes to evangelizing, I mentioned, so you basically can have workshops, various activities, various seminars, hands-ons, so on and so forth. The hackathon is also quite useful because you do a hands-on after a workshop, and you basically ensure that people can build APIs or build applications. So WSO2 also has a WSO2 hackathon in the box, which is a program, like a 1-day or 2-day program where we send some consultants on site, and you can actually, so they can work with various types of consumers or producers. Similarly, incentives is quite important. So as part of the same list, you need to have incentives, and incentives can be using the social capabilities that the API developer portal that provides already. So incentives go into that level, and you can have leaderboards, as you mentioned, and various reports. But all of these need to use analytics. So it's quite important that you have an analytics engine that listens to every API call, that collects this API information so that you basically can create various reports, various dashboards around this. So if you look at the various reports, you might need to see the top API users, the most number of API consumptions per month, the actual transactions per second or API calls per second, the top applications that are being built, and the amount of users that are using that application on a day-by-day basis, so on and so forth. So these analytics can be batch analytics or real-time analytics. So when it comes to real-time analytics, there are much more that can be done. You can enable notifications so that it basically notifies an application developer if something is going wrong with the backend API, or it can notify the API producer if there is, let's say, a health issue with the specific API. So in addition to analytics, monetization is key. So you need to be able to either use analytics to do your monetization, or even better, you should be able to plug in well-known monetization or billing engines to do your monetization. Again, if you already use some kind of a financial system, the platform needs to have the ability to plug into those financial systems, because you cannot be maintaining various information in different places. So monetization is key, and monetization is a core concept in order to successfully deploy a platform business model. Right? So again, we spoke about the unique business models that need to be accommodated in a platform business model. The same is true with an API marketplace. So the monetization engine should be powerful enough to accommodate those different types of digital business models. Okay, so then that brings us to finally what is called an enterprise API marketplace or platform. So what we looked at so far is basically what the platform business model is, the importance of a platform business model, and how a marketplace model ties into that, and how you'd go about building an API marketplace. So as we saw in the platform business model side, an API is basically a key concept for enabling a digital product and sharing certain aspects of the business with the rest of the stakeholders. So an API marketplace is a very core concept in enabling a platform business model, and a platform business model is quite a core concept in succeeding in today's digital world. Right? So it's a critical aspect of digital transformation or digital innovation. So it needs to start with an enterprise API marketplace. So you do hear of external public API marketplaces where you'd go and publish APIs, and then people or public consumers can come and consume APIs. But at the same time, it is quite critical and quite important that you have an enterprise API marketplace, so within your organization. So this is true for both small organizations or very large organizations. So one example is this reference architecture diagram. So this is based on like a large organization that we basically work with. So here you can see a typical model, right? So you have multiple business units. I mentioned business unit 1, 2, 3, and the N. So multiple business units. Each business unit has their own set of applications, core systems, core services, and they basically then expose APIs to the external world or the internal ecosystem or the internal marketplace. Right? So if you take business unit 1, their technology can be different. It can be a different API management technology, or it can be like a dedicated on-premise deployment. The business unit 2 can be a private cloud deployment. Business unit 3 can be an API cloud, a SaaS deployment. So example, WSO2 API cloud. Business unit 4 might be deploying their stuff with an API manager on the public cloud, right, on a different API management system. So each business unit needs to have its own marketplace as well. Right? Why? So within that business unit, you would expect developers of the business unit to be productive as well. So that means when APIs are published, it ends up in a developer portal that's local to that business unit. And you can have the testing happening there, subscriptions happening there, users accessing those APIs from that business unit, etc. Right? So internal BU developers basically have access to those business units. At the same time, there can be an enterprise API marketplace as well. So while you're publishing your APIs, these APIs end up in the internal business unit developer portal, but at the same time, it can end up also in an enterprise API marketplace, which can be a full API management solution, a platform, or it can be just an API developer portal component. So what that allows is for intra-BU access. Right? So business unit developers from different business units can come to this central enterprise API marketplace and discover APIs, test APIs, and subscribe to APIs and start using them. So once you have analytics around that, each business unit can see the number of external developers or external business unit developers that are consuming their APIs. And at an organizational level, the organization can see how much cross-business division, cross-business usage is happening. So in the long term, you can have a business model around that, which doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a financial model. Right? So it's within the organization itself. So mind you, we're still talking about internal API management. So an internal API marketplace is very useful here because it allows the business to abstract all of its underlying technology. But at the same time, it allows businesses to share APIs or publish APIs in a standardized manner, which complies to the organizational standards. So there needs to be a centralized governance and standards model. There needs to be a decentralized publishing model, a decentralized developer portal. Analytics has to be decentralized, but then it has to produce centralized analytics. And then you might have a centralized enterprise API marketplace. So once you have all of that in place, you can then selectively expose APIs to external users, external developers, or partners, B2B partners as well. So in that scenario, enterprise, you will have users accessing the enterprise API marketplace as well. It can just be a subset of APIs that are exposed externally, and there can be a central board or central user group which manages the enterprise API marketplace for external developers. So they can decide out of, let's say, the 60 different APIs that are available internally, that these 10 APIs will be published externally. So you can have an organizational governance policy of how these APIs are published externally as well. But the advantage there, of course, in the external and the internal marketplace is that now you have business unit developers who can reuse APIs, but who can come to a single location to subscribe to the APIs or to go to that API location, so on and so forth. Right? So that's basically the makings of an enterprise API marketplace and an enterprise API platform. To summarize that, what we are saying is that basically this platform business model or this marketplace concept is not something that is only interacts between stakeholders of internal and external systems. But even within an internal organization, a marketplace is a very useful concept. So you couple that with concepts like federated API management, distributed publishing, centralized governance, so on and so forth. And this basically provides you with a very good platform for internal innovation and creativity. And this is very important for staying ahead in the game and digitally innovating. So this is also important when it comes to the newer newer technology areas like microservices and containers, and how you basically play with them. Right? So you keep on increasing the number of services and APIs that are exposed by different disparate teams or business units or two-piece teams or whatever. But then you need a centralized model of publishing these APIs, discovering these APIs, governing and analyzing and monetizing these APIs. Right? So that's basically our talk for today, and hope that was useful. So just to summarize, we looked at the traditional business models of a linear business model or a pipe business model, and how a platform business model is different from that. We looked at the importance of a platform business model and why that is useful or important in digitally innovating in today's world, and to create digital products with a faster time to market, and basically to basically ensure that everyone can contribute towards the success of the organization. We looked at API marketplaces or marketplaces in a whole as a specialization of the platform strategy. We then looked at the various advantages of an API marketplace, and we looked at a use case which exemplifies those advantages. We basically went into these various steps of building an enterprise marketplace and looked at some of the technology areas there. And we then looked at an example of an internal enterprise API marketplace, a reference architecture for basically doing that. So, so that's our session for today. And so again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So there's one question here, which basically says, okay, so let me read that question. So, okay, the gist of it is how, so give some of the examples of like enterprise platform strategies, API platform strategies that are out there. So I think I already mentioned YouTube and Wikipedia as good examples, right? Good example business models which involve the stakeholders. So Uber is of course another model where you connect the riders of the platform with the drivers of the platform, right? And that platform model works only if all of the stakeholders are involved and successful. So then you have other complications as well there, right? So you need to rate the consumers and the producers. You need to ensure safety between them. You need to ensure transactions between them. And at the same time, you need to find out a unique business model where the platform company itself can make money as well, right? So those complications are there. Right? So about YouTube, Airbnb is another good example, which basically deals with the producers or the people who provide the residences or the houses with the consumers. And again, same problem. Right? Then you have specific commercial marketplaces like the e-commerce systems or systems built on that, like the Amazons and the eBays, who are more platform companies, but their main interface is also a marketplace where they focus on streamlining that sales process. So you streamline the creation and production of services, and at the same time the consumption of services. Okay, so another question is, how does runtime work with an enterprise marketplace? Does service go through two gateways in case of an enterprise marketplace? So let me just go back to that diagram. So in this specific example, each business unit, so you can have multiple responses, but each business unit would have its own runtime, its own gateway. So one model here is when you publish an API. So business unit 1 has its own API publisher, and it publishes an API. That API can go into the business unit 1's local API marketplace or developer portal, and it can be displayed in the enterprise API marketplace as well. So one model there is an external developer comes into the enterprise marketplace. He sees the APIs and he tests the APIs and does that. And to subscribe to APIs, if you click subscribe, it can take you to the local API marketplace if needed, and then you subscribe there. If not, you can do a subscription centrally and share the subscription information to the local system. But when you consume the API, the actual API endpoint will be in the local gateway. So the runtime in this federated architecture is going to be at each business unit. Because the idea is that you still follow a federated model. You have full control, but the advertising of the APIs and selectively the subscription of APIs are basically done centrally. But most of the other runtime stuff are done in a decentralized manner. So the response there is yes. Each business unit here will have a gateway. Okay, so the two questions and the responses to those questions. Again, if you have any other questions, you can contact WSO2 as well. There is a contact us form on the WSO2 site, so you can contact us through that. If you're interested in learning more about the various case studies or about the API manager or the various other products, again, feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to help you out. As mentioned previously, we'll basically be sharing the slides and sharing the recording as well. There is a white paper that's out there as well, building an API strategy using an enterprise API marketplace. And if you are in the city, if you're in New York City, for instance, we are having a summit in this month in September, 27th of September. And if you're in London, we are having a conference in London, I think in November. So there's multiple events. So basically, keep in touch and see you at the next event. Right, thank you.